There was a city underneath the city, a world operating in full daylight on the same streets where ordinary people bought bread and hailed cabs and argued over baseball. Except in this parallel world, the rules were written in blood, and the penalty for breaking them was getting shot in the face inside a restaurant in Coney Island. By 1930, this hidden city had grown so enormous, so tangled with money and murder and competing ambitions, that it was beginning to collapse under its own weight. Two men stood at the center of it, and no cap, neither of them was going to survive what came next. Giuseppe Masseria, Joe the Boss, had clawed his way to the top of the New York underworld during Prohibition, commanding the largest criminal faction in America. Across town, Salvatore Maranzano had arrived from Sicily with ambitions that would have seemed delusional to anyone who didn't know how dangerous he actually was. His faction was named for Castellammarese del Golfo, the coastal Sicilian town where many of his men were born, and he ran it with the precision of someone who had been planning this moment for years. He wanted what Masseria had, and Masseria was not giving it up. The killing started in February 1930. For 14 months, soldiers on both sides were assassinated in a pattern that was relentless but strategically incoherent, the kind of violence that accomplishes nothing except death. Bodies appeared in alleys, in parked cars, on the front steps of social clubs. The official death toll estimates run from 30 to over 60, but the real number was almost certainly much worse. This was a war eating both sides alive and producing nothing but corpses. The man who ended it was the same man who made the modern American mafia possible. Charles Luciano, Lucky, was Masseria's most capable lieutenant. He was also utterly convinced that his boss was a relic who would drag the whole enterprise down with him. Luciano had been holding quiet conversations with Maranzano's people for months. He had made calculations, and on April 15, 1931, he invited Masseria to dinner at a Coney Island restaurant called Nuova Via Tamaro. The tea on what happened next is almost too cinematic to be real. They ate. They played cards. At some point, Luciano excused himself to use the restroom. 4 men walked through the door: Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Siegel, and shot Joe the Boss to death right there in the dining room. When the police arrived, Luciano claimed he hadn't seen anything. He had been in the bathroom. Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi and reorganized New York's criminal landscape into 5 families, a structure that would define American organized crime for generations. His reign lasted 5 months. Luciano had already decided he was next. On September 10, 1931, 4 men posing as federal agents walked into Maranzano's office at the Helmsley Building in Midtown Manhattan and stabbed and shot him to death. Luciano abolished the boss of all bosses title entirely and replaced it with something he called the Commission, a governing body of equal bosses who managed disputes through negotiation rather than war, and in doing so, built the framework that would define organized crime in America for more than 50 years. The war that killed dozens of men had been the price of admission. Luciano looked at the carnage and decided it was the last lesson he needed. If you're finding this as wild as we do, hit subscribe and the notification bell. We drop deep dives like this every week. Imagine receiving a phone call informing you that your boss has been killed. Before you can process that information, your phone rings again. Your underboss, same news. You reach for your jacket. There's a knock at your door. You never answer it. This is what the Second Mafia War in Sicily felt like for the men who found themselves on the wrong side of it. Not a war you could fight your way through, but a systematic erasure that reached you before you even understood it had begun. Between 1981 and 1983, more than 1,000 people were killed across Sicily. This was not chaos. This was engineering. The The Corleones faction had been building toward this moment for years. Salvatore Reina and Bernardo Provenzano were not bosses who got angry and made reckless decisions. They were the kind of bosses who spent years quietly placing their own people inside rival organizations, mapping every alliance and every dependency within the Sicilian Cosa Nostra, and identifying the exact sequence in which the killing needed to happen to make organized resistance impossible. What they built was not a hit list, it was a collapse algorithm. Reina had been connected to the Cosa Nostra since his teenage years and had killed his first man by the time he was 19. His whole formation was inside an organization that treated violence as a professional skill and rewarded it accordingly. The rise of the Corleones within the Sicilian Mafia was a slow, patient accumulation of influence, achieved through strategic marriages, deliberate cultivation of loyal networks, and the selective elimination of rivals who could not be co-opted. Reina's forces killed the Palermo bosses first, the men who led the traditional families opposing Corleone's expansion. Their underbosses followed within days. Soldiers who might have rallied surviving factions were eliminated before they could organize. Entire clans that had controlled Sicilian territories for decades were erased from the organizational map within weeks. The Camorra faction, one of the most powerful Palermo-based families, was dismantled so completely that it ceased to exist as an operational entity. The turning point came when Reina extended his campaign beyond rival mafiosi to the representatives of the Italian state. General Carlo Alberto Dell'Acqua was assassinated in Palermo in September 1982, along with his wife. The campaign escalated across a decade and culminated in 1992 with the bombings that killed prosecutors Giovanni Falcone on May 23rd and Paolo Borsellino on July 20th, the architects of the Maxi trial that had convicted 338 mafia members in the most successful prosecution of organized crime in Italian history. Reina believed that killing the men who led the fight would demoralize the institutions behind them. He was catastrophically wrong. The assassinations produced a national mobilization the Corleones never calculated into their model. Emergency legislation was enacted. Military units were deployed across Sicily. Informants who had maintained silence for decades began cooperating. Reina was arrested on January 15, 1993, after more than 2 decades as a fugitive in a Palermo apartment looking exactly like the ordinary man he had never once been. The men who had won the war had miscalculated the peace so badly they had essentially orchestrated their own destruction.
Before we say the name, picture this. 60 men dead across a single American city over a single decade. Men shot in cars on residential streets, stuffed into trunks, pulled from harbors. A war that started because of an argument at a Labor Day party in 1961, an actual Labor Day party, in which a personal dispute between members of 2 rival Irish-American criminal factions escalated so quickly that within weeks men were dying, and within years the entire criminal architecture of Greater Boston had been reorganized around the survivors. The McLaughlin brothers ran criminal operations in Charleston. On the other side stood James Buddy McLean and the Winter Hill faction out of Somerville, competing for bookmaking and loan sharking territories across Greater Boston. The Labor Day incident was personal, but the war it detonated was structural. Both sides had grievances that had been building for years. The personal provocation was just the match. The war consumed its own leadership with the efficiency of a machine built for exactly that purpose. Bernie McLaughlin was shot dead on a Charleston sidewalk in 1961. Buddy McLean was shot and killed in 1966. George McLaughlin was convicted of murder in 1964. By the time the killing subsided, the men who had started the war were either dead, imprisoned, or irrelevant. And among the men who rose through the violence, watching, calculating, positioning himself with patience his associates found almost unsettling, was a South Boston enforcer named James Whitey Bulger. Bulger had returned from federal prison in 1965 and inserted himself into the winning faction with the precision of someone who understood that war creates opportunities that peacetime never provides. He watched which men were cooked by the violence and which ones thrived. He made himself useful. He made himself indispensable. When the war ended and the reorganization began, he was exactly where he needed to be. The 60 men who died in the Boston Irish Gang War didn't die for Whitey Bulger, but their deaths were the price of the rearrangement that allowed him to rise, and he would go on to dominate Boston's criminal underworld for 2 decades through a corrupt alliance with the FBI that became one of the most damaging relationships in American law enforcement history. The war killed 60 men. Its most enduring consequence was the one man it elevated who nobody had been watching closely enough. Drop a like if you're deep in it. It helps more people find this story. Segment 4, the Bonanno War. Here is what you need to understand about Joseph Bonanno before the story of his fall makes any sense. He was, for more than 30 years, genuinely brilliant at what he did. He had led the family bearing his name since 1931, and he had done so with a strategic vision that set him apart from most of his peers. He was an elder statesman, a survivor. And then, sometime around 1963, he decided all of that wasn't enough. He allegedly conspired to assassinate 3 of his fellow commission bosses, Carlo Gambino, Stefano Magaddino, Thomas Lucchese, in a bid to consolidate power across multiple families simultaneously. The plot was exposed. No cap, he was cooked before the war even started. The commission's response was institutional: strip Bonanno of authority, order him to retire, install new leadership. Bonanno refused. What followed from approximately 1964 to 1968 became known publicly as the Bonanno War, a name Bonanno reportedly hated, which is the kind of detail that feels important somehow. The family fractured, loyalists on one side, a commission-aligned faction on the other. The violence was intermittent but sustained: shootings, bombings, disappearances across New York, and it produced no clear resolution. Both sides ground each other down without either achieving decisive victory. Bonanno withdrew to Arizona in 1968, ceding operational control without ever formally surrendering it. What he left behind was a family weakened, internally divided, and stripped of the credibility that had once made it a serious player. That vulnerability was what allowed FBI agent Joseph Pistone, operating under the alias Donnie Brasco, to infiltrate the Bonanno family beginning in 1976. He spent 6 years inside. He attended meetings, built relationships with men who trusted him completely. By the time his true identity was revealed, more than 100 convictions resulted. The Bonanno family was subsequently removed from the commission entirely, the only New York family to suffer that specific humiliation. The war Joseph Bonanno started to expand his power ended by permanently diminishing it. His legacy is a lesson in what happens to a man who has been winning for decades, convinces himself the rules don't apply to him anymore. Segment 5, the Profaci-Gallo War. Joseph Profaci had led the family that would eventually bear the Colombo name since 1928. He was one of the original 5 commission bosses. He had been in power so long that his authority had calcified from something earned into something simply assumed. And the way he used that authority, specifically the way he used the men below him, was the kind of thing that breeds exactly the kind of war that eventually arrived at his doorstep. The T is he was squeezing his own soldiers. Every family ran on tribute payments flowing upward. That was the arrangement. What Profaci did went beyond the standard arrangement. He required payments from his crews that left them in their own accounting, working primarily to enrich a boss who contributed little to their daily operations. The resentment had been building for years. The man who finally acted on it was Larry Gallo, operating alongside his brothers Albert and the now legendary Joey Gallo out of a Red Hook Brooklyn crew with a legitimate grievance and very limited tolerance for disrespect. Profaci refused their demands for a larger share and greater autonomy. In February 1961, the Gallos kidnapped several of his top allies, including underboss Joseph Magliacco, and held them as leverage. Profaci agreed to new terms. He did not honor them. Within months, hit teams were dispatched. Larry Gallo survived a strangling attempt at the Sahara Lounge in Brooklyn only because a police officer walked in during the attack, the kind of detail that sounds invented but is documented fact. Joey Gallo was imprisoned for extortion charges in 1961 and spent most of the conflict behind bars. Profaci died of cancer in 1962, and the conflict outlasted him, continuing under successive leadership. At least 9 confirmed deaths resulted, the real figure almost certainly higher. The war demonstrated something the commission was supposed to prevent. When a boss exploits his own soldiers past the point of tolerance, there is no structural mechanism to remedy that grievance short of violence. The division the Gallos fought over was never fully healed. It would resurface repeatedly over the following decades, contributing to the Colombo family becoming the most internally unstable of the 5 New York families, an instability that would eventually produce an even bloodier conflict. Subscribe for more. We cover the full story every week, no fluff.
Picture the most profitable criminal enterprise in American history. The French Connection, at its peak in the late 1960s, was supplying an estimated 80 to 95% of the heroin consumed in the United States. Not a majority, not most of it, almost all of it. Turkish opium processed in Marseille laboratories moved through Corsican networks into American ports, distributed through mafia families to a market so massive it generated money almost beyond conventional accounting. And then, between 1971 and 1975, the whole apparatus was dismantled. The Corsican milieu in Marseille had built something genuinely extraordinary. The pipeline required coordination across multiple countries, multiple criminal networks, and multiple layers of official corruption: French, Italian, Paraguayan, American. Auguste Record managed distribution through Paraguay. Jean-Baptiste Croce operated laboratories in Marseille. These were sophisticated logistical enterprises that had been running for over a decade. The Nixon administration's declared war on drugs applied diplomatic pressure to the French government that had not previously existed. French authorities launched coordinated raids on the Marseille laboratories in a campaign unprecedented in scope. What accelerated the destruction was internal. As law enforcement pressure intensified, competitors within the Corsican milieu began eliminating each other, each faction attempting to inherit the pipeline's routes and infrastructure as the network collapsed. The betrayals were preemptive. The killing was both external and internal simultaneously. By 1975, the pipeline was effectively dead. Record had been arrested and extradited to the United States in 1972. Croce had been arrested in 1971. The destruction of the French Connection didn't end the drug trade, it redistributed it. Southeast Asian suppliers moved into the space within years. South American cocaine networks were already beginning to emerge as a parallel phenomenon. What they had built was one of the most efficient criminal logistics operations in history, and its destruction demonstrated both the vulnerability of any network that depends on geography and the resilience of any market that depends on addiction. Segment 7. The Third Colombo War. The Colombo family had never fully healed from the Profaci-Gallo conflict that split it in the early 1960s. The factional lines drawn in that war were suppressed, not erased. By the late 1980s, the internal tension had built again around a structurally inevitable question. What happens to a family whose official boss is serving a 139-year sentence from a federal prison cell? Carmine Persico had been convicted in 1986 and wasn't going anywhere. He had appointed Victor Orena to manage operations in the interim, and Orena, watching the months turn into years, began acting less like a caretaker and more like a permanent chief executive. The Persico loyalists noticed, and in the summer of 1991, someone tried to kill Orena outside his girlfriend's home on Long Island. He survived. The war that followed did not observe the restraint that prior Colombo conflicts had maintained. Between 1991 and 1993, the Third Colombo War produced 12 confirmed murders and at least 15 attempted killings. Soldiers and associates from both factions shot in cars, outside homes, in social clubs, and on public streets across Brooklyn and Long Island. Bystanders were wounded in at least 2 incidents, generating the kind of public attention that neither faction had calculated into their planning. They were cooked before they even realized how exposed they'd made themselves. The war ended not through military victory, but through mass prosecution. Federal authorities had been monitoring both factions through wiretaps and informants throughout the entire conflict. Every act of violence generated new witnesses, new surveillance material, new potential cooperating defendants. The war itself, the thing both factions had initiated to resolve a leadership dispute, became the evidentiary foundation for the indictments that dismantled them both simultaneously. Orena was convicted of racketeering and murder conspiracy in 1992 and sentenced to life. The Persico faction retained nominal control of a family so depleted in manpower and earning capacity that the nominal control was almost meaningless. The Third Colombo War demonstrated something federal prosecutors had understood since the mid-1980s. Mafia wars were no longer just internal problems. They were evidentiary gifts to the agencies watching from outside. If this is hitting different, smash that like button. It genuinely helps the channel. Segment 8, the Philly Mob War. 3 bosses killed in 10 years. That is the Philadelphia story. Before the names and the bombs and the bodies and trunks, understand that this was a family that functioned, not brilliantly, but adequately, under a management philosophy that prioritized stability above everything else. Angelo Bruno had led the Philadelphia family since 1959. He avoided narcotics, he maintained productive relationships with the New York families. He governed through consensus. His men thought he was leaving money on the table. They were right. They just had absolutely no idea what the cost of taking that money would be. Bruno was shot in the back of the head on March 21st, 1980, sitting in his car outside his South Philadelphia home. The killing had been authorized by his own underboss, Antonio Caponigro, who had convinced himself that Bruno's conservative approach to narcotics was costing the family millions. What Caponigro had not done was obtain commission approval for the hit. Within weeks, Caponigro and his brother-in-law were found in the trunk of a car in the Bronx. The state of the bodies made the commission's message impossible to misread. Philip Testa was installed as Bruno's successor. On March 15, 1981, less than a year after taking power, Testa was killed by a nail bomb packed under the porch of his home. The Philadelphia family was now on its 3rd boss in 13 months. The man who stepped into that vacancy was Nicky Scarfo, and the decade that followed was one of the most violent episodes in the history of American organized crime outside New York. Scarfo channeled his volatility into a management style of systematic paranoia. He suspected disloyalty everywhere. He ordered the murder of men whose offense was appearing insufficiently committed. He created a climate of fear so intense it accelerated the very defections he was trying to prevent. The people most likely to cooperate with federal investigators were the ones who believed, accurately, that their own boss was planning to kill them. Between 1980 and 1990, more than 30 members and associates were murdered. By the time Scarfo was convicted on RICO charges in 1988 and sentenced to 55 years, the family was a fraction of what it had been. 3 bosses, 30 plus dead. The Philadelphia Mob War was the story of a family that survived every external threat it had ever faced, and then destroyed itself entirely.
Naples has a violence problem that is inseparable from a structural problem. The Camorra is not an organization. It is an ecology. It is not a hierarchical structure with a boss at the top who can be arrested to produce institutional collapse. It is a constellation of autonomous clans, dozens of them, competing for territorial control across the city and its surrounding provinces, each capable of operating independently. The Camorra Wars, a term encompassing overlapping clan conflicts from the late 1970s through the 2000s, killed an estimated 3,500 people. That number does not represent a single war. It represents the permanent condition of an organization defined by competition. Rafael Cutolo, who built the Nuova Camorra Organizzata from inside a prison cell, was in many ways the most extraordinary figure the Camorra produced. Charismatic, intellectually serious, and utterly ruthless, his expansion through the late 1970s was so rapid that it terrified established Camorra clans into forming a unified coalition, the Nuova Familia, specifically to oppose him. The war between these two factions, fought between 1980 and 1983, killed an estimated 400 people in the Naples metropolitan area alone. The Scampia feud of 2004 and 2005, fought between the Second Allegian Alliance and the De Lauri clan in the public housing towers of northern Naples, brought military-grade violence to residential streets in daylight. Teenagers were recruited as soldiers. Shootings occurred in front of witnesses. The scale of civilian exposure,
people shot accidentally, people shot deliberately to intimidate, people caught in crossfire, generated international media attention and a state response deploying thousands of additional police and carabinieri to the region. Italian authorities arrested hundreds of Camorra members under anti-mafia statutes during the worst periods of violence. They dismantled clans, they convicted leaders, and within months of each prosecution, successor clans had emerged from the same territories with the same economic logic and the same violent methodology. The Camorra was resilient in exactly the way a decentralized network is always resilient. You cannot decapitate something that has no single head. The wars were not a failure of the organization. They were the organization functioning exactly as its structure required it to function. The cycle continues. It is continuing now. We're covering the cartels, the triads, and more. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it. A town of 5,000 people, 233 dead. No cap, there is no proportional equivalent in the modern history of organized crime in the Western world. The First 'Ndrangheta War of San Luca, fought in a Calabrian hill town between 1985 and 1991, produced casualty figures that would be staggering in a city and are almost incomprehensible in a community smaller than some college campuses. San Luca occupies a specific position in the mythology of the 'Ndrangheta, regarded within the organization as one of its founding locations, a place where the traditions and organizational codes of the 'Ndrina were established and maintained through generations. When the Nirta Strangio and Pelle Voteri Romeo clans began fighting over that control, they were fighting over something both sides understood could not be divided or compromised. It had to be won. What distinguished the San Luca War from other organized crime conflicts was its intimacy. In a community of 5,000, the combatants went to the same schools, the same churches, the same festivals. Families that had known each other for generations received news of each other's deaths at intervals too frequent to process. The retaliatory logic meant every killing created an obligation to response, not just a tactical calculation, but a social and familial imperative. Italian authorities struggled to intervene in a community where the code of silence was reinforced by bonds of blood and history no outside agency could penetrate through conventional methods. The war eventually subsided through exhaustion, negotiated settlement, and targeted imprisonment, but the conflict had been exported. In August 2007, members of the Nirta Strangio clan shot and killed 6 people outside a restaurant in Duisburg, Germany, the deadliest act of organized crime violence on German soil. The San Luca feud had followed the 'Ndrangheta's expansion across Europe. Law enforcement agencies on multiple continents were forced to reassess the operational reach of an organization they had previously regarded as a regional phenomenon. A town of 5,000 produced a war that killed 233 of its residents and eventually exported its violence to another continent. Every war on this list began with the same calculation. Someone decided the cost of fighting was lower than the cost of accepting the status quo. Sometimes that calculation was correct in the short term. Territory gained, rivals eliminated, power consolidated. It was almost never correct in the long term. The organizations that won their wars emerged weaker than they had been before the fighting started. Depleted in membership, compromised in operational security by the attention violence attracts, penetrated by informants who chose cooperation over the certainty of dying in someone else's power struggle. The men who started these wars believed they were building empires. What they were building, in most cases, was the evidentiary foundation for their own destruction. The violence that was supposed to consolidate power made them visible, and visibility in their world was the one thing none of them could afford. That is what every mafia war has in common. Not the killing, the cost. If you made it to the end, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make this for. Subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications. The next one drops soon. Don't miss it.